The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Arizona, as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the general store, her arms full of supplies for the week ahead. The wooden planks of the sidewalk creaked under her worn boots, a familiar sound that had become the rhythm of her solitary life. At 32, Sarah had learned to find comfort in routine, in the predictable patterns of frontier town that asked few questions about a woman's past. Her cabin sat 3 miles outside town, nestled against the red rock formations that rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a small corral for her mare, Dancer, but it was hers. After fleeing an arranged marriage in Philadelphia 5 years ago, Sarah had traveled west with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from her grandmother. The isolation suited her independent spirit, though the loneliness sometimes pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't name. The sound of raised voices pulled her from her thoughts as she secured her purchases in the saddlebags. Near the sheriff's office, a crowd had gathered, their voices creating a low rumble of anger and excitement. Sarah's stomach tightened as she recognized the familiar signs of trouble brewing in a town where tensions between settlers and the local Apache bands ran as deep as the canyon cuts in the surrounding landscape. "He's nothing but a thief," someone shouted. "Caught him red-handed stealing from Peterson's ranch." Sarah moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her usual desire to avoid the town's drama. Through the gaps between bodies, she caught sight of Sheriff Hawkins, his weathered face set in grim lines as he gripped the arm of a young Apache man who couldn't have been more than 16. The boy's dark eyes darted frantically around the crowd, and Sarah saw something that made her heart clench. Not defiance or anger, but pure, desperate fear. The young Apache was slight for his age, his clothes torn and dusty for what had clearly been a rough capture. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, and his hands were bound with rope that looked painfully tight. But what struck Sarah most was the dignity he tried to maintain despite his terror, the way he held his head high even as the crowd pressed closer with their accusations and threats. "String him up now and save us all the trouble," called out Marcus Webb, the town's blacksmith and a man whose hatred for the Apache was well known. "These savages don't understand anything but violence." "That's enough," Sheriff Hawkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah could see the uncertainty in his stance, the way his eyes flickered between the boy and the angry faces surrounding them. Hawkins was a decent man, but he was also political enough to know which way the wind blew in Cedar Ridge. What exactly did he steal? Sarah found herself asking, her voice cutting through the noise. The crowd turned to look at her, and she felt the familiar weight of their judgment. A woman alone, asking questions that weren't her business. She could read their disapproval in their faces. Peterson stepped forward, a large man with hands stained permanently black from working cattle. "Caught him in my pasture this morning, trying to cut out one of my steers. My boys chased him down near Devil's Canyon." Sarah studied the young Apache's face, noting the confusion that flickered across his features at Peterson's words. Either the boy was an exceptional actor, or there was more to this story than a simple case of cattle theft. She had learned, in her years of observing people, to trust the instincts that had served her well in Philadelphia's social circles and serve her even better in the honest brutality of frontier life. "Did anyone actually see him cutting the animal?" she pressed, stepping closer to the group. "Or was he just in the pasture? What difference does it make?" Webb snarled. "Apache in a pasture means only one thing. They're all thieves and murderers." The young man's head snapped up at Webb's words, and for the first time, he spoke. His English was careful but clear, tinged with an accent that spoke of 2 languages living in one mouth. "I was not stealing. I was tracking my grandmother's horse. She wandered from our camp 3 days ago." "Lies," Peterson spat. "They're all liars. Every last one of them." But Sarah caught something in the boy's voice, a ring of truth that resonated with her own experience of being misunderstood and prejudged. She had faced her share of assumptions in this town. A single woman must be desperate, damaged, or dangerous. She recognized the weight of unfair judgment in the young Apache's eyes. "Sheriff," she said, turning to Hawkins, "has anyone checked if there's actually a missing steer? Or if there might be a stray horse in the area?" Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't really—" "It's exactly my concern," Sarah interrupted, surprised by the steel in her own voice. If this boy is innocent, then we're about to commit a terrible injustice. And if he's guilty, then proper investigation will prove it. The crowd's murmur grew uglier, and Sarah realized she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. In defending the Apache boy, she had aligned herself against the town's judgment, against the fears and prejudices that held Cedar Ridge together like mortar between stones. The woman's gone soft on savages, someone muttered from the back of the crowd. Maybe she's been dealing with them out at that cabin of hers, added another voice, and Sarah felt the accusation hit her like a physical blow. In a town where reputation was everything and suspicion could destroy a person's livelihood, such suggestions were dangerous. But as she looked at the young Apache, really looked at him, she saw something that reminded her of her younger brother back in Philadelphia. Daniel had been small for his age, too, with the same way of holding himself when cornered, the same desperate dignity in the face of forces beyond his control. Daniel had died of consumption when he was 17, and Sarah had never forgiven herself for not fighting harder for him against their father's harsh discipline. "What's your name?" she asked the boy gently, ignoring the crowd's growing hostility. He hesitated, glancing between her face and the sheriff's grip on his arm. "Joseph," he said finally. "Joseph Crow Feather." "Well, Joseph Crow Feather, I believe you deserve a fair hearing before anyone decides your fate." Sheriff Hawkins looked increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd's anger began to focus on Sarah as much as on the boy. "Miss Mitchell, I think you should head on home now. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me because it's happening in front of me," Sarah replied, "and because I've seen what mob justice looks like, and it's never pretty." The truth was, Sarah had seen exactly that kind of justice in Philadelphia, when the Irish workers had been accused of stealing from the docks. She had watched from her father's carriage as men with families and children were beaten by crowds convinced of their own righteousness. The memory still made her sick, and she had promised herself never to stand by and watch such a thing again. "You're making a mistake, lady," Webb warned, stepping closer to Sarah. "These people aren't like us. They don't think like us, don't value life like we do. That boy would cut your throat as soon as look at you." Sarah met Webb's gaze steadily, drawing on every lesson her grandmother had taught her about standing firm in the face of bullies. "The only mistake I see is judging someone without evidence. And the only throat-cutting I'm worried about is what might happen to an innocent boy if we let fear guide our actions." The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut. Sarah could feel the crowd's mood shifting, their anger seeking a new target now that she had made herself one. She realized with a mixture of fear and determination that she had committed herself to a course of action she couldn't abandon without betraying everything she believed about justice and human dignity. Joseph Crow Feather's dark eyes met hers, and she saw something that surprised her. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of recognition, as if he understood exactly what she was risking on his behalf. In that moment, Sarah felt a connection that transcended the vast differences in their backgrounds and experiences. "Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet street, "I'd like to request that you hold this boy in your jail until a proper investigation can be conducted. I'll post his bond myself." The offer sent a shocked ripple through the crowd. Posting bond for an Apache was unheard of in Cedar Ridge, a gesture that would mark Sarah permanently as someone who couldn't be trusted to maintain the careful racial boundaries that kept the town feeling safe. Sheriff Hawkins stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. "Miss Mitchell, I'm not sure the bond for a theft charge would be $50, Sarah said firmly, though the sum represented a significant portion of her savings. "I have it with me." As she reached into her reticule for the money, Sarah became aware of how quiet the street had become. Even the usual sounds of the town, children playing, dogs barking, the distant sound of hammering from the blacksmith shop, seemed muted, as if the entire community was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The young Apache looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why?" he asked simply. It was a question Sarah couldn't answer easily, couldn't explain without revealing too much about her own past, her own reasons for understanding what it felt like to be judged unfairly. Instead, she simply said, "Because everyone deserves a chance to prove their innocence." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah wondered if she truly understood what she had set in motion, what forces she had awakened by stepping between the town's anger and this frightened boy who reminded her so much of the brother she had failed to save. The $50 felt heavier than it should have as Sarah counted out the bills into Sheriff Hawkins' reluctant palm. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. She had crossed a line that most people in Cedar Ridge wouldn't have dared approach, and everyone present understood the implications. "This is a mistake you'll regret," Marcus Webb said, his voice low and threatening. "Mark my words, woman, no good comes from defending their kind." Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, though her hands trembled slightly as she tucked her reticule back into her coat. "I suppose we'll find out," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well then, I guess that settles it for now. Come on, boy." He gestured for Joseph to follow him toward the jail, but his movement was gentler now, less like he was handling a dangerous criminal and more like he was dealing with an inconvenient complication. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah caught fragments of conversations that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Words like Apache lover and betrayer followed her as she made her way back to where Dancer stood patiently tied to the hitching post. She could feel eyes boring into her back, could sense the way the town's opinion of her was shifting like sand in a windstorm. Joseph Crow Feather glanced back at her once before disappearing into the sheriff's office, and something in his expression told Sarah that this was far from over. Whether that was a promise or a warning, she couldn't tell. The ride back to her cabin gave Sarah time to think about what she had done, and with each passing mile, the weight of her decision settled more heavily on her shoulders. She had lived in Cedar Ridge for 5 years, carefully building a reputation as a quiet, respectable woman who kept to herself. In a single morning, she had thrown all of that away for a boy she had never seen before and might never see again. But as Dancer's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth, Sarah found she couldn't regret her choice. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding her of the stories she had told about helping runaway slaves in Pennsylvania, about the times when doing right meant doing what was unpopular. The measure of a person, her grandmother used to say, isn't what they do when everyone's watching and approving. It's what they do when they're the only one willing to stand up. The cabin came into view as the sun reached its zenith, a small, sturdy structure that had become her sanctuary over the years. Sarah had built much of it herself, learning carpentry from a gruff but kind man named Tom Fletcher who had taken pity on her obvious inexperience. The work had been hard, but satisfying in a way that her privileged life in Philadelphia had never been. She spent the afternoon trying to focus on her usual chores, tending her small vegetable garden, mending a tear in her spare dress, organizing her supplies, but her mind kept drifting back to the morning's events. She found herself wondering about Joseph Crow Feather's family, whether they knew he was missing, whether they were searching for him even now. The Apache bands in the area had been relatively peaceful in recent years, though tensions still ran high. Most of the raids and conflicts happened further south, but the fear they generated spread like wildfire through settlements like Cedar Ridge. Sarah had encountered Apache individuals a few times during her years in the territory, usually at trading posts or during chance meetings on the trails, and had found them to be no different from anyone else. Some friendly, some wary, all trying to make their way in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to their presence. As evening approached, Sarah lit her oil lamps and settled down with a book, but the words seemed to swim on the page. She kept finding herself listening for sounds that didn't belong, hoofbeats, voices, anything that might suggest her actions had consequences beyond the immediate discomfort of the town's disapproval. She was just preparing for bed when she heard it, a soft sound that might have been whined through the rocks, if not for the deliberate pattern it carried. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to the lamp wick, every sense suddenly alert. The sound came again, and this time she recognized it as a bird call, but no bird she knew made that particular sound at that time of night. Moving carefully to the window, Sarah peered out into the darkness beyond her small circle of lamplight. The desert night was alive with sounds she had learned to recognize over her years of solitary living. The distant call of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through stone. But underneath it all was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She was being watched. The realization came not from any specific sight or sound, but from an instinct she had developed during her solitary life. the same instinct that had warned her away from dangerous men in Philadelphia saloons and steered her clear of rattlesnakes on desert trails. Someone was out there in the darkness, studying her cabin with intent she couldn't fathom. Sarah's first impulse was to blow out the lamps and hide, but she forced herself to think rationally. If someone meant her harm, they would hardly announce their presence with deliberate sounds. More likely, this was connected to her defense of Joseph Crow Feather, but whether that connection boded well or ill, she had no way of knowing. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She opened her front door and stepped out onto the small wooden porch, making no attempt to hide her presence. The desert air was cool against her skin, carrying scents of sage and dust and something else, smoke from a fire that had been carefully banked to minimize its visibility. "I know you're out there," she called softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "If you want to talk, I'm listening." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, like shadows taking solid form, 3 figures emerged from the rocks about 50 yards from her cabin. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of lifetimes spent in harmony with a harsh landscape, and, even in the dim starlight, Sarah could see they were Apache. The central figure raised his hand in what might have been greeting or warning. Sarah couldn't tell which. He was tall and lean, with gray threading through his long black hair, and he carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a leader. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are the woman who spoke for Joseph Crow Feather today." It wasn't a question, and Sarah found herself nodding even though she wasn't sure they could see her clearly in the darkness. "Yes," she said, "I am." "Why?" The same question Joseph had asked, and one that seemed to demand more than the simple answer she had given in town. Sarah considered her words carefully, knowing that whatever she said now could determine whether these men saw her as friend or threat. "Because he looked afraid, and I don't think afraid boys steal cattle," she said finally. "Because everyone deserves someone to believe in their innocence until it's proven otherwise. Because it was the right thing to do." The leader was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion she couldn't identify. "Joseph Crow Feather is my grandson. His grandmother's horse, a painted mare with white markings, was indeed missing from our camp 3 days ago. The boy went to search for her, as was his duty." Sarah felt a wave of vindication mixed with sorrow. She had been right about Joseph's innocence, but that knowledge came with the bitter understanding of how close the town had come to punishing an innocent young man for the crime of being Apache in a place where that alone made him guilty. "Where's the horse now?" she asked. "We found her yesterday, caught in wire fence 2 miles from where your townspeople captured my grandson. She had cuts on her legs, but she will heal." The old man paused. Joseph was following her trail. He would never steal cattle. He knows the price Apache pay for such accusations. The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Of course Joseph would know the price. How many Apache men had been killed for crimes they didn't commit? How many families had been destroyed by the kind of mob justice she had witnessed that morning? "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more deeply than she could express. "I'm sorry for what almost happened, and I'm sorry for the fear he must have felt." The old man took a step closer, and in the starlight Sarah could see his face more clearly. It was deeply lined, marked by years of sun and struggle, but his eyes held a dignity that reminded her powerfully of his grandson. "My name is Charles Crow Feather," he said. "Joseph is the son of my daughter, who died 3 winters ago. He is precious to me, as his grandmother was precious to me before she passed to the spirit world last spring." Sarah understood then why the boy had been searching for the horse. It wasn't just any animal. It was a connection to his dead grandmother, a living link to someone he had loved and lost. The idea that he would have been punished for such devotion made her anger flare hot and bright in her chest. "Is there anything I could do to help?" she asked. "I have some money left, if you need it for a lawyer, or—" "You have already done much," Charles Crow Feather interrupted gently. "More than we had any right to expect from a white woman in a white town. But there is something you should know." He gestured to his companions, and they stepped forward into the dim light. Sarah could see they were younger men, probably around her own age, with a kind of watchful alertness that spoke of lives lived on constant guard. "Joseph is not the first of our young men to be accused of crimes in your town," Charles continued. 2 months ago, another boy was taken by your sheriff. He was found dead in his cell 3 days later. Your sheriff said he tried to escape. The words hit Sarah like ice water. Dead. Beaten, said one of the younger men, his English heavily accented, but his meaning clear. Beaten until his spirit left his body. Sarah felt her knees go weak. The casual cruelty she had witnessed that morning suddenly took on a much darker significance. If she hadn't intervened, if the crowd's anger had been allowed to run its course, Joseph Crow Feather might have suffered the same fate. That's why we came tonight, Charles said quietly. To thank you and to warn you. There are men in your town who will not forgive what you did today. Men who see kindness to Apache as betrayal of their own people. Sarah thought of Marcus Webb's threatening words, of the hostile faces in the crowd, of the way conversation had died when she passed. She had known there would be consequences, but she was beginning to understand that those consequences might be more severe than she had imagined. I can't undo what I did, she said. And I wouldn't if I could. We do not ask you to, Charles replied. But we would ask you to be careful. These men, they are capable of great violence when they feel their power is threatened. The warning hung in the night air between them, laden with implications Sarah didn't want to consider. But even as fear crept up her spine, she found her resolve hardening rather than weakening. If standing up for Joseph had put her in danger, then so be it. She had run from one fight in Philadelphia, fleeing her father's plans for her life rather than standing and fighting. She wouldn't run again. Thank you for the warning, she said. And thank you for telling me about Joseph's grandmother's horse. It helps to know I was right about him. Charles Crow Feather nodded slowly. Joseph asked me to give you this. He stepped forward and placed something small and warm into Sarah's palm. In the starlight, she could see it was a small piece of carved stone, smooth and polished, with symbols etched into its surface. What does it mean? She asked. It is a token of gratitude, Charles explained. But more than that, it is a promise. If you ever have need of help, if these men who threaten you act on their threats, you have only to show this token to any Apache you meet. We take care of those who take care of us. The simple statement carried a weight that made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. In her years of isolation, she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than herself, to have allies who would stand with her when things got difficult. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you will be careful, Charles replied. Say you will remember that you are not as alone as you think. As the three men melted back into the shadows from which they had come, Sarah stood on her porch for a long time, turning the carved stone over in her palm and thinking about the strange path her life had taken. She had come west to escape the restrictions and expectations of Philadelphia society, only to find herself caught up in conflicts that made her old life's problems seem simple by comparison. But as she finally went back inside and prepared for bed, Sarah realized something had changed in her. The isolation that had been both her protection and her prison for 5 years was beginning to crack. For better or worse, she was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the quiet woman who lived alone in a cabin outside Cedar Ridge. She was now Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had stood between an Apache boy and a lynch mob, and that she decided as she finally blew out her lamp was identity she could live with, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning brought consequences that Sarah had expected, but hoped might be delayed. She discovered them when she rode into town for supplies and found that Morrison's General Store, where she had traded for 5 years, was suddenly closed to her business. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Morrison said through the barely cracked door, her face flushed with embarrassment but her voice firm. My husband says we can't serve you anymore. Not after, well, you know what you did. Sarah sat on Dancer's back, staring at the closed door and feeling the weight of isolation settling around her like a heavy cloak. She had known this would happen, had prepared herself for it intellectually, but the reality of being shut out from the community she had called home for 5 years hit her harder than she had anticipated. The pattern repeated itself throughout the morning. The bank manager suddenly found reasons why her usual transactions couldn't be processed. The doctor's wife crossed the street to avoid walking past her. Even children who had always waved to her now stared with the solemn curiosity of young people who knew something significant had happened, but didn't quite understand what. But it was the encounter at the livery stable that truly opened Sarah's eyes to the depth of the hostility she now faced. She had gone there to buy grain for Dancer, a routine transaction that had never involved more than pleasantries about the weather. Instead, she found herself facing Tom Fletcher, the same man who had taught her carpentry, and whom she had considered something approaching a friend. "Can't help you today, Sarah," he said without meeting her eyes. "Can't help you any day, as it turns out." "Tom," she said, dismounting and walking toward him, "surely you don't believe—" "What I believe doesn't matter," he interrupted, finally, looking at her directly. "What matters is that defending Apache gets a person marked as an Indian sympathizer around here. And Indian sympathizers find it mighty hard to stay in business." The blunt honesty of his words was almost refreshing after the polite excuses she had endured all morning. "So this is about money." "This is about survival," Tom corrected. My wife's, my children's. I got a family to feed, Sarah, and I can't do that if half the town decides they don't trust me anymore." Sarah understood then that her actions had consequences that rippled far beyond her own life. By forcing the community to choose sides, she had put anyone who might support her in an impossible position. Either they could stand with her and risk their livelihoods, or they could abandon her to protect their families. "I understand," she said quietly, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Tom Fletcher's weathered face softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. That boy didn't look like no cattle thief to me either. But right and practical don't always go hand in hand in a place like this." As Sarah rode home empty-handed, she found herself thinking about the carved stone Charles Crow Feather had given her. The Apache had promised help if she needed it, but what kind of help could they provide that wouldn't make her situation worse? Any visible association with Apache people would only confirm the town's worst suspicions about her loyalties. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the smoke. It was a thin column rising from somewhere near her cabin, visible against the afternoon sky like a dark pencil mark. Sarah's heart began to race as she urged Dancer into a gallop, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possibilities. Had someone burned her cabin in retaliation for her defense of Joseph? Had a hostility in town escalated to outright violence? But as she crested the small hill that overlooked her property, Sarah pulled Dancer to a sharp halt, her mouth falling open in shock at what lay before her. Her cabin was intact, but her yard was no longer empty. Dozens of Apache people had gathered there, men, women, and children spread across the open space in what looked like a temporary camp. Horses grazed in her pasture alongside wickiups, the traditional Apache dwellings that had been constructed with the easy efficiency of people accustomed to making themselves at home wherever they needed to be. The smoke she had seen was coming from several small cooking fires, around which women were preparing what smelled like an evening meal. Children played in the dust, their laughter carrying on the desert wind, while men sat in small groups, engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation. Sarah's first thought was that she was somehow under siege, that the Apache had come to her cabin for reasons she couldn't fathom and couldn't escape. But as she sat frozen on her horse, trying to process the impossible scene before her, she noticed that no one seemed hostile or threatening. In fact, several people had looked up at her arrival and were waving in what appeared to be friendly greeting. An elderly woman approached, walking with the slow dignity of advanced age, but with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and something that might have been amusement. She was followed by a group of other women, and as they drew closer, Sarah could see that they carried bundles and baskets, offerings of some kind. "You are Sarah Mitchell," the elderly woman said in careful English. "The one who spoke for Joseph Crow Feather." "Ah, yes," Sarah managed, dismounting from Dancer but staying close to the horse's reassuring bulk. "But I don't understand. What is all this?" The woman smiled, and her weathered face transformed with genuine warmth. "This is gratitude. I am Maria Crow Feather, grandmother to Joseph. These are our people, some from our band, some from other bands who heard what you did." Sarah looked around the camp with growing amazement. There were far more people than she had initially realized, at least 100, maybe more, representing what seemed to be multiple family groups. The logistics of moving so many people to her isolated cabin must have been enormous, yet they had appeared as silently as morning mist. "I don't understand," she repeated. "Joseph is safe. The charges will be dropped. There's no need for— The charges will be dropped," Maria interrupted, her expression sharpening. The question caught Sarah off guard. In her assumption that justice would prevail now that the truth was known, she hadn't considered that the legal system might not be interested in truth when it conflicted with prejudice. "Won't they be?" she asked uncertainly. Maria's expression grew sad. "Child, You have much to learn about justice for Apache people. Your sheriff will not release Joseph easily, and your townspeople will not forget their anger. They need someone to blame for their fear, and an Apache boy in jail serves that need well. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had thought her intervention had saved Joseph, but perhaps all she had done was delay an inevitable tragedy. Then what can we do? We can show your people that Joseph Crowfeather is not alone, Maria replied. That he has family who care for him, family who will not allow him to disappear quietly in a jail cell. As if to emphasize her words, more Apache arrived even as they spoke. They came in small groups, some on horseback, some on foot, filtering in from the desert like water, finding the lowest point. Sarah realized with growing awe that word of Joseph's arrest and her intervention had spread far beyond Charles Crowfeather's immediate band. "How many are coming?" she asked. Charles Crowfeather materialized at her elbow, moving with the silent grace she was beginning to associate with his people. As many as heard the story and chose to come. Perhaps 170. Perhaps more. 170 Apache people. On her property. Sarah's mind reeled at the implications. If the townspeople of Cedar Ridge had been hostile to her defense of a single Apache boy, what would they do when they discovered that she was hosting what amounted to a gathering of multiple bands? "This is going to make things worse," she said, though even as she spoke, she wasn't sure she cared. When people in town hear about this, they will understand that we are not the scattered, powerless people they believe us to be," Charles said quietly. "They will understand that Joseph Crowfeather matters to many, many people." A young man Sarah hadn't seen before approached their group. He was perhaps 25, with the lean build of a warrior and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, his English was better than Charles's, suggesting education beyond what most Apache received. "Miss Mitchell, my name is David Crowfeather. I am Joseph's cousin. I attended the Indian school in Carlisle before returning to my people." He paused, and Sarah could see the weight of difficult decisions in his face. "I have been chosen to speak with your townspeople about Joseph's situation." "Speak with them how?" "We will go to your town tomorrow morning," David explained. "Not as raiders or threats, but as concerned family seeking justice for an innocent boy. We will ask them to examine the evidence fairly, and we will offer to compensate Mr. Peterson for any trouble our presence may have caused." The plan was reasonable, diplomatic, and Sarah was absolutely certain it would be a disaster. The people of Cedar Ridge were already convinced that Joseph was guilty, and the sight of dozens of Apache warriors riding into their town would only confirm their worst fears about savage retribution. "They'll see it as an invasion," she warned. "They'll think you're coming to attack them." "Perhaps," Charles acknowledged. "But they will also see that we are not sneaking in darkness or hiding in mountains. We come openly, in daylight, seeking to talk rather than to fight. This is the behavior of people who believe in their cause." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself drawn into conversations with people who challenged every assumption she had ever held about Apache culture and intelligence. David Crowfeather spoke several languages fluently and had read more books than most of the men in Cedar Ridge. Maria regaled her with stories of her youth, when the Apache lands had stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, and conflict with white settlers was unthinkable. A woman named Elena, who appeared to be about Sarah's age, explained the intricate kinship systems that bound the various Apache bands together, making Joseph's arrest a concern not just for his immediate family, but for a network of relatives and allies spanning much of the Southwest. "In your culture," Elena explained as they sat by one of the fires, "a person in trouble turns to the law, to judges and sheriffs and lawyers. In our culture, a person in trouble turns to family. And for Apache, family means much more than parents and children. So all these people are related to Joseph, related or connected through marriage or bound by friendships that go back generations," Elena confirmed. "When one of us is threatened, we all respond. It is how we have survived." Sarah thought about her own isolation, about how completely she had cut herself off from any support network when she fled Philadelphia. The contrast with the community gathering around her was stark and somewhat humbling. But as the night deepened and she lay in her bed listening to the quiet sounds of the camp outside her window, Sarah found herself worrying about what the morning would bring. She had stepped between Joseph and a lynch mob on impulse, driven by instinct and principle. But Now she was caught up in something much larger, a confrontation between two communities that saw each other as threats rather than neighbors. The carved stone Charles had given her lay on her bedside table, catching the moonlight that filtered through her window. It was supposed to be a symbol of protection, of alliance with people who understood the value of standing together against injustice. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would test all of them in ways they weren't prepared for. She thought about Tom Fletcher's words about survival versus principle, about the impossible choices that frontier life forced on everyone who tried to live decent lives in indecent circumstances. She had made her choice when she defended Joseph, but now she was learning that individual choices had collective consequences, that her actions had set in motion events that could affect dozens or even hundreds of lives. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but as Sarah finally drifted towards sleep, she realized something important. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't facing her problems alone. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it surrounded by people who understood the value of standing up for justice, even when, especially when, it was dangerous to do so. Outside her window, the Apache camps settled into the quiet rhythms of night, but Sarah could feel the tension thrumming through the darkness like a wire pulled tight. Everyone was waiting for morning, when words and intentions would be tested against the harsh realities of fear and prejudice. She only hoped they were all strong enough for whatever came next. Dawn broke over the desert with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything seem possible and dangerous at the same time. Sarah woke to the sound of organized activity outside her cabin. The low murmur of voices speaking in Apache, the soft sounds of horses being prepared for travel, the efficient bustle of people who had been awake for hours making ready for something momentous. When she stepped outside, Sarah found herself in the midst of what could only be described as a military preparation, though one unlike anything the U.S. Army would have recognized. The Apache were organizing themselves with the fluid efficiency of people who had perfected the art of moving together across hostile territory for generations. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. More than 170 Apache men, women, and children were preparing to ride into Cedar Ridge, a town that could probably muster perhaps 50 adult men if every rancher and drifter within 20 miles answered call to arms. The potential for violence was enormous, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she bore responsibility for setting these events in motion. Charles Crow Feather approached her, dressed in what was clearly his finest clothing, a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork and leather pants that had been carefully maintained despite obvious age. His long gray hair was braided with strips of colored cloth, and he wore a necklace of bear claws that spoke of both dignity and power. "You are troubled," he observed, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone accustomed to watching for subtle signs of danger. "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "Charles, if this goes wrong, if the townspeople see this as an attack, people are going to die. Good people on both sides." The old man nodded gravely. "This is always true when two peoples meet who have been taught to fear each other. But consider this. If we do nothing, Joseph dies alone in a jail cell, and nothing changes. If we try to speak and are met with violence, at least the world will see who chose war over words." David Crow Feather joined them, and Sarah could see that he, too, understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Miss Mitchell, we want you to know that you can stay here if you choose. No one would think less of you for remaining at your cabin while we go into town." The offer was clearly meant kindly, but it sparked a flash of anger in Sarah that surprised her with its intensity. "Are you suggesting I hide while you face the consequences of my actions?" "I'm suggesting that you've already risked enough," David replied calmly. "You've already done more for Joseph than we had any right to expect. Joseph is sitting in that jail because I convinced Sheriff Hawkins to arrest him instead of letting the mob have him," Sarah said firmly. "If anyone bears responsibility for what happens today, it's me. I'm coming with you." The simple declaration seemed to ripple through the gathering Apache, and Sarah became aware that their conversation was being closely watched by dozens of people. She realized that her decision to accompany them would be seen as a powerful symbol. A white woman choosing to stand openly with Apache people in the face of almost certain hostility from her own community. Maria Crow Feather materialized beside her, carrying a bundle of cloth that she pressed into Sarah's hands. "Then, you must dress appropriately for such an important day. Sarah unfolded the bundle to reveal a dress unlike anything she had ever seen. It was made of soft leather, dyed a deep brown, and decorated with patterns and beads and colored threads. The workmanship was exquisite, and she could see that it represented hours of skilled labor. "I can't accept this," she protested. "It's too beautiful, too valuable." "It belonged to my daughter," Maria said quietly. "Joseph's mother. She was about your size when she died, and I think she would be pleased to know it was worn by someone who protected her son." The weight of the gift was overwhelming. Sarah understood that she was being offered more than clothing. She was being invited to become part of the family, to take on not just the privileges but the obligations that came with such acceptance. With trembling fingers, Sarah accepted the dress and went into her cabin to change. When she emerged, she felt transformed in ways that went deeper than mere appearance. The leather was soft against her skin, and the beadwork caught the morning light in ways that made her feel like she was wearing captured sunlight. The effect on the Apache gathered in her yard was immediate and visible. Conversations stopped, and she found herself the center of respectful attention. Charles Crow Feather nodded his approval, and Maria smiled with tears in her eyes. "Now you look like family," the old woman said simply. The ride to Cedar Ridge took on the character of a procession rather than a simple journey. The Apache traveled in loose formation, with scouts ranging ahead and behind to watch for trouble. Sarah rode near the front alongside Charles and David, acutely aware that she was probably the most visible symbol of the alliance between their peoples. As they crested the hill that overlooked the town, Sarah saw that Cedar Ridge was already in a state of high alert. Men with rifles stood on rooftops, and she could see crowds gathering in the streets. Word of their approach had clearly preceded them, probably carried by early risers who had spotted the massive group moving across the desert. "It's not too late to turn back," David said quietly, though his tone suggested he didn't expect her to take the offer. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied. "It was too late the moment I opened my mouth yesterday morning." Sheriff Hawkins met them at the edge of town, accompanied by a dozen men Sarah recognized as the more level-headed citizens of Cedar Ridge. His face was pale, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "That's far enough," he called out when they were still 50 yards from the first buildings. "State your business, and then move along." Charles Crow Feather nudged his horse forward, stopping just close enough for normal conversation. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the still morning air, and Sarah realized that his words were intended for the entire town to hear. "I am Charles Crow Feather, grandfather to Joseph Crow Feather, who is held in your jail. I come with my family to ask that you examine the evidence against my grandson and consider whether justice is being served." The simple, dignified statement seemed to catch Sheriff Hawkins off guard. He had clearly been prepared for demands or threats, not a polite request for due process. "The boy was caught stealing cattle," Hawkins replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "My grandson was tracking his grandmother's horse, which had been missing for 3 days," Charles responded. "We have found the horse, injured by wire fence, 2 miles from where you arrested Joseph. We have brought witnesses to testify to the horse's disappearance and recovery." David Crow Feather rode forward, carrying a leather pouch that he offered to the sheriff. "We also bring payment for any trouble our presence may have caused, Mr. Peterson, and compensation for the time Joseph has spent in your jail." The diplomatic approach was masterful, and Sarah could see it working on some of the townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation. These weren't the savage raiders of their nightmares. These were people behaving with more civility than the mob that had nearly lynched Joseph the previous day. But not everyone was impressed by Apache diplomacy. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and what might have been embarrassment of being shown up by people he considered inferior. "Don't listen to their lies," he shouted. "They're just trying to get their boy back, so they can turn him loose to steal again. We all know what they're capable of." "What are we capable of, Mr. Webb?" The question came from an unexpected source. Elena, the Apache woman who had explained kinship systems to Sarah the previous evening. She had ridden up behind the main group, and her English was perfect and coldly precise. "You're capable of murder and rape and burning out decent folks," Webb snarled. "Don't think we've forgotten the raids, the killings." Elena's horse stepped delicately forward, and Sarah was amazed to see that the Apache woman showed no sign of fear despite being surrounded by hostile armed men. "I attended the Indian school at Carlisle, Mr. Webb. I can read and write in 3 languages. I have studied your history as well as my own. Shall we discuss what your people are capable of? Shall we talk about Sand Creek, or the Long Walk, or the children torn from their families and sent to schools designed to kill the Indian in them? The challenge hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Sarah had never heard anyone in Cedar Ridge speak so directly about the brutal history of Indian-white relations, and the effect was electric. Some of the townspeople looked uncomfortable, others angry, but all were clearly forced to confront the reality that this Apache woman knew more about their shared history than most of them did. Sheriff Hawkins, clearly sensing that the conversation was spiraling beyond his control, held up his hands for silence. Look, I appreciate that you folks are concerned about the boy, but the law is the law. He was found on Peterson's land, and Peterson says he was stealing cattle. Where is Mr. Peterson? Charles asked calmly. We would like to speak with him directly. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before someone in the crowd called out that Peterson was at his ranch dealing with sick cattle. The excuse was obviously fabricated, and several of the townspeople looked embarrassed by the transparent lie. Perhaps, David suggested with diplomatic politeness, we could all ride to Mr. Peterson's ranch and examine the evidence together. If there is a missing steer, we would be happy to provide compensation. If there is not, then perhaps we can clear up this misunderstanding. It was a reasonable request, and Sheriff Hawkins was clearly struggling to find grounds to refuse it. But before he could respond, Marcus Webb exploded again. This is ridiculous. We're standing here negotiating with savages like they're our equals. They've got no rights here, no standing to make demands. The ugly words hung in the morning air, and Sarah saw several Apache hands move instinctively toward weapons before discipline reasserted itself. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with the potential for violence crackling like electricity in the dry air. It was then that Sarah made her second life-changing decision in 2 days. She urged Dancer forward until she was positioned between the two groups, clearly visible to everyone present. Mr. Webb, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. I think you've forgotten something important. This is still America, and in America, people are innocent until proven guilty. These people aren't making demands. They're asking for the same justice any of us would want for our children. The sight of Sarah in Apache dress, speaking for Apache rights, seemed to break something in Webb's self-control. You, he snarled, pointing at her with a shaking finger. You Apache-loving whore. You betrayed your own kind for these animals. The insult hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Charles Crowfeather's horse moved between her and Webb with fluid precision. When the old Apache spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an undercurrent of steel that made several of the townspeople step back involuntarily. You will not speak of this woman with disrespect, Charles said simply. She has shown honor when others showed only hatred. She has earned the protection of my family, and my family protects what it values. The threat was unmistakable, though politely phrased, and Marcus Webb seemed to realize for the first time that he was outnumbered by people who had not come to town unprepared for violence. His bluster deflated slightly, though his hatred remained visible in every line of his face. Sheriff Hawkins, clearly desperate to defuse the situation before it exploded into gunfire, stepped between the two groups. All right, enough. I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'll send a deputy to Peterson's ranch to check on this missing steer business. If there's no missing cattle, we'll talk about releasing the boy. But I want all of you Apache folks to move back out of town while we sort this out. No, Charles said firmly. We will wait here for the deputy's report. We have come in peace. We have spoken with respect, and we will not be driven away like dogs because our presence makes some people uncomfortable. It was a direct challenge to the sheriff's authority, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who had no intention of backing down. Sarah could see Hawkins calculating odds, looking at the Apache gathered behind Charles and the townspeople behind him, clearly trying to figure out whether he had enough firepower to enforce his will if negotiations broke down. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with both sides waiting to see who would blink first. And in that moment of perfect tension, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just Joseph's fate, but the future relationship between the Apache and the settlers of Cedar Ridge. Everything balanced on the edge of a word, a gesture, a single moment of miscalculation that could send the whole situation spiraling into violence that would haunt both communities for generations to come. The tension stretched until Sarah thought it might snap like an overdrawn bowstring. Sheriff Hawkins stood between two groups of armed people, his weathered face reflecting the knowledge that he was one wrong word away from a massacre that would be remembered long after everyone present was dead. The Apache sat their horses with the patient stillness of people accustomed to waiting for exactly the right moment to act, while the townspeople shifted nervously behind their hastily erected barricades. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the silence. "Sheriff Hawkins, I'd like to speak." Everyone turned to see Tom Fletcher emerging from the crowd of townspeople, his carpenter's hands hanging empty at his sides, but his face set with the determination of a man who had made a difficult decision. Sarah felt a flicker of hope as he walked deliberately into the space between the two groups. "Tom," Sheriff Hawkins said warningly, "this isn't the time. This is exactly the time." Tom interrupted. He turned to face Charles Crow Feather, and Sarah could see the effort it cost him to speak publicly against the prevailing sentiment of his community. "Mr. Crow Feather, I want you to know that not everyone in Cedar Ridge agrees with what's happening here. Some of us think your grandson deserves a fair hearing." The simple statement seemed to break a dam that had been holding back other voices. One by one, townspeople began to speak up. Not all of them, but enough to show that the community was not as united in its hostility as the loudest voices would suggest. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, stepped forward hesitantly. "I've been thinking about what Miss Mitchell said yesterday, about innocent until proven guilty. Maybe we should listen to what these people have to say." Dr. Barnes, a man Sarah had always respected for his willingness to treat anyone who needed medical care regardless of their ability to pay, nodded his agreement. "I examined the boy yesterday evening when Sheriff Hawkins asked me to check on him. He doesn't look like a cattle thief to me. He looks like a scared kid who doesn't understand why he's been locked up." The momentum was building, and Sarah could see Sheriff Hawkins beginning to realize that he might have more support for a peaceful resolution than he had initially believed. But she could also see Marcus Webb's face growing redder with each defection for his hardline position. "You're all being fooled," Webb snarled. "They're putting on an act, making themselves look reasonable, so we'll let our guard down. The minute we show weakness, they'll turn on us like the animals they are." Charles Crow Feather's response was to dismount from his horse, a gesture that sent a ripple of surprise through both groups. An Apache warrior on foot was more vulnerable, but also less threatening, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. "Mr. Webb," Charles said, walking slowly toward the angry blacksmith, "you speak of us as animals, but animals do not ride 60 miles to ask for justice through words instead of weapons. Animals do not bring their children and grandmothers to a place where they might be harmed. Animals do not offer payment for damages they did not cause." He stopped just out of arm's reach of Webb, and Sarah could see the contrast between the two men clearly. Webb red-faced and bristling with hatred, Charles calm and dignified despite the insults that had been hurled at him. "You fear us because you do not know us," Charles continued. "You think we are different from you in ways that matter. But we love our children as you love yours. We grieve for our dead as you grieve for yours. We want safety and prosperity for our families as you want for yours. The only difference between us is that we have been forced to fight for these things while you have been able to take them for granted." The quiet words had more impact than any shouted threat could have managed. Even some of Webb's supporters looked uncomfortable with the comparison, forced to confront the humanity of people they had been taught to see as less than human. It was then that a commotion at the edge of town announced the arrival of Peterson's foreman, riding hard and looking like a man with urgent news to share. He pulled up near Sheriff Hawkins, his horse lathered with sweat and his own face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. "Sheriff," he gasped, "I need to tell you something about yesterday morning. About the Apache boy." Sheriff Hawkins looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Go ahead, Jenkins." The foreman glanced nervously at the assembled crowd, clearly aware that his words would be heard by dozens of people who would remember them long after the immediate crisis had passed. "Well, sir, after all the excitement yesterday, I went back to check our cattle count. Truth is, we haven't lost any steers. Not a one." The admission fell into the assembled crowd like a stone into still water, sending ripples of reaction in all directions. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Joseph had spent a night in jail for a crime that had never been committed. "But Peterson said," Webb began. "Mr. Peterson was mistaken," Jenkins said firmly, though sweat beaded on his forehead as he contradicted his employer. He saw the Apache boy in the pasture and assumed the worst, but when we counted the cattle properly, they were all there. Every single head accounted for. Sheriff Hawkins closed his eyes briefly, and Sarah could see him calculating the political cost of admitting that an Apache boy had been jailed based on nothing more than prejudice and false assumptions. When he opened them again, his face had aged years in the space of moments. "Is there anything else, Jenkins?" The foreman nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. We found a painted mare caught up in the wire fence on the north section, just like these folks said. Cut up pretty bad, but she's Apache marked for sure. Looks like she'd been there for days." The corroborating evidence was overwhelming, and even Marcus Webb seemed to deflate as his justifications crumbled around him. Joseph Crow Feather had been exactly where he said he was, doing exactly what he said he was doing. The only crime committed had been the assumption that an Apache boy in a white man's pasture must be up to no good. Charles Crow Feather received the news with the dignity of a man who had never doubted his grandson's innocence. But Sarah could see the relief in his eyes. "Sheriff Hawkins," he said formally, "we would like to take our grandson home now." The request hung in the air, simple and reasonable, but weighted with implications that everyone present understood. Joseph's release would be an admission that the town had been wrong, that their prejudices had nearly led them to commit a terrible injustice. For some, like Sheriff Hawkins, it would be a relief to do the right thing. For others, like Marcus Webb, it would be a humiliating defeat that would be difficult to forgive or forget. Sheriff Hawkins looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache and white, hostile and sympathetic, all waiting to see what kind of man he would prove himself to be when tested. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I'll need to file the proper paperwork, but yes, the boy can go home. The charges are dropped." The words released a tension that Sarah hadn't fully realized she had been carrying. Joseph Crow Feather was free. The immediate crisis was over. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew that the larger issues that had created this confrontation remained unresolved. The Apache began to organize themselves for the journey home, their departure as efficient and orderly as their arrival had been. But Charles Crow Feather approached Sarah before mounting his horse, his weathered face reflecting emotions too complex for easy interpretation. "You have given my family a great gift," he said simply. "Not just Joseph's freedom, but the knowledge that there are still white people willing to stand for justice, even when it costs them dearly." Sarah thought about the costs. Her isolation from the community, the loss of business relationships, the uncertain future that now stretched before her. But as she looked around at the Apache families preparing to reunite with Joseph, she found that she couldn't regret her choices. "What happens now?" she asked. Charles considered the question carefully. "Now we learn to live as neighbors instead of enemies. It will not be easy. Too much has happened. Too much blood has been spilled on both sides. But today has shown that it is possible." As the Apache delegation rode out of Cedar Ridge with Joseph Crow Feather riding proudly among them, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of townspeople who had supported the peaceful resolution. Tom Fletcher clapped her on the shoulder with rough affection. "You did good, Sarah," he said simply. "Took courage to stand up like you did." But even as she accepted the congratulations of her supporters, Sarah was aware that others in the crowd were watching her with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright hostility. Marcus Webb, in particular, looked like a man who would neither forgive nor forget what he saw as her betrayal of her own people. The weeks that followed proved to be a time of adjustment for everyone involved. Sarah found that while she had lost some customers and social connections in Cedar Ridge, she had gained others. People who respected her stand for justice sought her out, and slowly, a new pattern of relationships began to emerge. More importantly, the events surrounding Joseph's arrest had opened lines of communication between the Apache bands and the more reasonable elements of the white community. Charles Crow Feather made several more visits to town, always with advance notice and always for specific, peaceful purposes: trading, medical care for an injured child, negotiations over grazing rights that had been disputed for years. Sarah's cabin became an unofficial meeting place where representatives from both communities could gather on neutral ground. The discussions were often difficult, sometimes heated, but they represented something that had been missing from the region for too long: actual communication between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Elena, the Apache woman who had attended Carlisle, became a frequent visitor and, eventually, something approaching a friend. Through her, Sarah learned about Apache customs and history, while Elena learned about the fears and misunderstandings that drove white hostility toward her people. Change is slow. Elena told her one evening as they sat on Sarah's porch watching the sunset paint the desert rocks in shades of gold and red. Generations of mistrust cannot be healed in months or even years. But every conversation like the ones we have here makes the next conversation a little easier. Joseph Crow Feather himself visited several times, always with family members, but increasingly confident in his dealings with the white world. Sarah was struck by how quickly he had recovered from his traumatic arrest, but Charles explained that Apache children were taught from an early age to endure hardship without letting it break their spirits. Joseph knows now that not all white people are enemies, Charles said during one of these visits. This is a lesson that will serve him well as he grows to be a leader among our people. The changes weren't all positive, of course. Marcus Webb and his supporters made life difficult for anyone they saw as Apache sympathizers, and there were several ugly incidents that reminded everyone how fragile the peace really was. Sarah's windows were broken twice by thrown rocks, and someone poisoned her vegetable garden in an act of petty but pointed malice. But for every act of spite, there seemed to be a corresponding gesture of support. Tom Fletcher quietly replaced her broken windows without being asked. Mrs. Henderson brought her cuttings from her own garden to replace the destroyed vegetables. Dr. Barnes made a point of publicly consulting with Apache healers about traditional remedies, legitimizing their knowledge in the eyes of his white patients. Perhaps most importantly, Sheriff Hawkins began enforcing the law more even-handedly, making it clear that Apache people who came to town on legitimate business would be protected from harassment. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a significant improvement over the arbitrary hostility that had previously greeted any Apache presence in Cedar Ridge. As autumn approached, and the first anniversary of Joseph's arrest neared, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange path her life had taken. She had come west seeking independence and isolation, only to discover that true independence sometimes required standing with others against injustice. The carved stone Charles had given her still sat on her bedside table, but it was no longer just a token of Apache gratitude. It had become a symbol of something larger. The possibility that people who seemed fundamentally different could find common ground in their shared humanity. One evening, as she sat on her porch reading by lamplight, Sarah became aware of a familiar presence in the darkness beyond her circle of light. She looked up to see Charles Crow Feather approaching on foot, moving with the silent grace that still amazed her. "Good evening, Charles," she called softly. "Is everything all right?" The old Apache leader settled himself on the porch steps with a quiet grunt, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. "I came to tell you that our council has been discussing the future of our relationship with your people. Not just the conflict and the fighting, but the possibility of something better." Sarah set down her book, sensing that something important was about to be shared. "What kind of something better?" "A formal treaty," Charles said simply. "Not with your government. We have learned not to trust promises made in Washington, but with the people of Cedar Ridge specifically. An agreement that we will respect your property and your peace, and you will respect ours." The proposal was staggering in its implications. Sarah knew of no precedent for a local treaty between Apache bands and individual white communities. Such an agreement would have to be negotiated carefully, with input from both sides and guarantees that both could live with. "What would such a treaty include?" she asked. "Trading rights. So our people can come to your town to buy supplies and sell crafts without fear of harassment. Grazing agreements so cattle and horses can be pastured without conflict over boundaries. Medical cooperation so our healers and your doctor can work together when people are hurt or sick." Charles paused, studying her face. "And most importantly, a commitment that children from both our peoples will be safe when they travel in each other's territories." It was an ambitious vision, and Sarah could see both its potential and its pitfalls. "And you think the people of Cedar Ridge would agree to such a thing?" Charles smiled, and she could see a hint of the optimism that had sustained his people through decades of conflict and displacement. "I think some would, and I think that if we start with some, we might eventually convince others. Change begins with the brave, not the comfortable." As they talked through the details of such an arrangement, Sarah realized that she was being invited to play a role she had never imagined for herself, that of a mediator between two peoples who desperately needed to find a way to coexist. It was a daunting responsibility, but also an extraordinary opportunity to help shape a future based on cooperation rather than conflict. The moon was high by the time Charles took his leave, disappearing into the desert darkness as silently as he had appeared. But his words lingered in Sarah's mind as she prepared for bed, opening up possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Standing on her porch one last time before going inside, Sarah looked out over the landscape that had become her home. Somewhere out there, Apache families were settling in for the night around carefully banked fires, while in Cedar Ridge, white families were doing the same behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Between them lay miles of desert that could be a barrier or a bridge, depending on the choices made by people of goodwill on both sides. As she finally went inside and blew out her lamp, Sarah found herself thinking about Joseph Crow Feather, probably asleep by now in his family's wickiup, safe and surrounded by people who loved him. She had saved one Apache boy from an unjust fate, but perhaps more importantly, she had helped open a door to a future where such injustices might become increasingly rare. It wasn't a perfect solution. There was no perfect solution to problems rooted in generations of mistrust and conflict, but it was a beginning, a first step toward something better. And sometimes Sarah reflected as sleep finally claimed her, first steps were the most important steps of all. The carved stone caught the last rays of moonlight through her window, a small symbol of a large hope that tomorrow might be built on understanding rather than fear. It had been a long journey from that moment when she first saw a frightened Apache boy surrounded by an angry mob, but every step of that journey had led her to exactly where she needed to be. In defending Joseph Crow Feather, Sarah had discovered not just her own courage, but her capacity to be part of something larger than herself. The 176 Apache who had appeared at her cabin had taught her that family could transcend bloodlines, that justice required allies, and that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with words, patience, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of redemption. As the desert wind whispered through the rocks outside her window, carrying with it the scents and sounds of a land large enough for all its children, Sarah Mitchell smiled at her sleep and dreamed of tomorrow.